Well, he's got a lot more stuff than me.
Yes.
What he wrote this book, and he wrote that's his name right there,
Yeah. Cool, Jordan.
and he was he's the official historian of Rankin Bass Productions, the production company behind Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, their most famous production, by the way. As a matter of fact, it's celebrating its 60th anniversary this year, and it's moved back to NBC because it's now owned by NBC Universal Comcast. And
Right.
yeah, yes, exactly. And is also the 55th anniversary of Frosty the Snowman, another production they produced. And it's also the 50th anniversary of Twas the Night Before Christmas, mouse special, which I watched. I've had the habit of watching every October because they say the problems again a few months ago. And they Year Without a Santa Claus. They made the Year Without a Santa Claus. Me and Dad, we love singing and dancing to the Snow Miser and Heat Miser songs.
That's right. Now,
Yeah.
now, Rick, Jordan he's got the whole uh, script memorized of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and he can say it with the TV turned completely off and be right on cue.
Uh,
He's a huge fan of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer.
Yeah, I have one of those little toys I have. Well, this is kind of a knockoff shirt by the most guests, and I also have a special painted sign which lists Christmas as one of my special interests. Man cave at the E, it's basically Christmas, and it's got Rudolph and Clarice on it, and Frosty, and I don't know, it's just. But there is the leg lamp in the Christmas Story, which you can actually see in the mirror right over there.
right.
And we also I also have Buddy the Elf, which also has the inspiration from of the Foreman Elf from this movie, of this little TV
Right.
special. Um, Buddy
Right.
the Elf's costume is the Foreman Elf. Might as well just do what Sam the Snowman says. Let's pull up an ice block and lend an ear.
Yeah,
Right.
okay.
So I know your first question was about how Rudolph came about, and as time goes on, I'm learning more about that. You know, not only was it because Arthur Rankin and Johnny Marks were neighbors in New York, but it was also because Arthur Rankin hired Larry Romer, who was given the director's credit of Rudolph. And Larry Romer was involved with television. So he had a friend at NBC that could get Rankin Bass specials on NBC. So it was kind of a combination of things how Rudolph got on television. It was the fact that Arthur knew Johnny Marks, who wrote the song Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and got his brother-in-law involved, Robert L. May, who wrote the storybook. And then Larry Romer had a friend at NBC that could get it on the air. And General Electric, who was the sponsor, had a guy named Willard Saloff in the entertainment part of their business. And Willard Saloff, before he went to NBC or to General Electric, he also worked at Montgomery Ward's. So it kind of all came together at one time where all these people had some knowledge of Rudolph and that it would work on television and that General Electric could sponsor the show, just like Timex did 2 years earlier with Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol. So was kind of a combination of all those things that caused Rudolph to air on NBC 60 years ago.
Well, for those of you who are not aware, Montgomery Ward is one of the precursors to what we now call today Amazon. They just ship catalogs out. You order from the catalogs and the item is shipped to you from the catalog. Of course, now we do it online. It's called Amazon.
Right.
Any other questions for me?
And the thing about Montgomery Ward was Robert L. May worked there. And he came up with this idea of a red-nosed reindeer for a storybook that the store would give away each Christmas. And when he left Montgomery Ward, they were kind enough to give him the copyright back on the Rudolph character so he could have his brother-in-law write a song about Rudolph. And eventually this television special was made by Arthur Rankin and Jules Bass. And I know you know the script word by word, and Romeo Muller was another important component because he really came up with all of the other characters that are in the story. The Island of Misfit Toys, the Bumble, Hermie the Elf, Sam the Snowman, none of those characters would have existed without Romeo Muller and Tony Peters, who designed the characters. And those two were like the Stan Lee and Jack Kirby of Marvel Comics. You know, they created all these characters from scratch, and they deserve more credit than they get. And actually, their estates deserve all the money that this merchandising has been, going on year after year.
Every year. I was just gonna say that when I just first saw this on a VHS tape as a kid, the Tony Peters production design, to me as a kid, it had that nostalgic feel of simplicity and American size. Big, like too big is not big enough.
Well, Tony Peters kind of came out of the UPA style of animation. In fact, I think he did some work for UPA, and he was a simplistic designer. And 2 years before Rudolph, Rankin Bass did some General Electric commercials that I located a couple of years ago, and they're in my new book on The Year Without a Santa Claus and 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. He designed Christmas carolers, and Maury Laws did the music for the commercials, and they were selling GE products. And the reason that the Christmas carolers had sort of light bulb noses was because, the tie-in with General Electric and their light bulbs. And he continued that in Rudolph, and that's why all the elves have that bulb-looking nose. It's on purpose to sort of mimic the General Electric light bulbs.
Makes good
Makes sense, doesn't it?
yeah, which makes good exterior illumination and
Right.
especially for the holidays.
Well, you asked about why they went with the stop motion for Rudolph. And the reason for that was Arthur Rankin in the late 50s went to Japan with a delegation from Washington and discovered what he would term animagic. He found that the animators in Japan were experts at stop motion, which Arthur always loved George Pal and any stop motion that existed prior to the early 60s. So he found an animator Tadahito Moshinaga, who was the father of stop motion in Japan. And he did the New Adventures of Pinocchio in Animagic. And the reason that Arthur did Pinocchio was that was his favorite Walt Disney movie. He loved everything about it, especially the design and the art style. But he saw that these Japanese animators could do wonders with Animagic stop motion. And he thought that would work well in the US market. And Pinocchio was a syndicated series where local television hosts could show one segment each day for 5 days and it would tell a full story. And in Chicago here, it was on WGN on Garfield Goose and Friends. And I never saw those because that was before my time, but he had to finance that on his own. So he had to take out bank loans and he even had to borrow from one of his good friends from the Navy and to finish it. And he didn't like that arrangement because he didn't make back the money as quickly as he would have liked. So that's what led to the General Electric sponsorship. And what General Electric did was they entered the entertainment business with Arthur Rankin and Jules Bass. And that division was called Tomorrow Entertainment. So they would finance the Rankin Bass specials and they would actually own the specials, General Electric would. And Arthur would get paid by them. So it was a better financial setup for Rankin Bass Productions, which back then was known as Videocraft International. And the reason they called it Videocraft International was they worked in so many different places. The voice actors were in Canada, the animation was done in Japan, and the music was recorded in England. Maury Laws, for a long time, lived in England, even though he was from South Carolina. So I guess it was more economical to record in England with their musicians than it was in the US. But Rankin Bass was headquartered in New York. And in the early days, the location that they worked from was also Arthur's residence. So he had one floor of his residence set up for art and business, and then the other levels were for his family. So it was kind of an interesting setup, but they worked all over the globe, and that's why they were known as Videocraft International, and eventually they just called themselves Rankin Bass Productions.
That's work from home before COVID even happened, and I adopted the work from home thing. I current job I have is work from home, and I'm enjoying it.
Good. Yeah, Arthur always pretty much worked from home, even when in the later days, I visited Arthur in his penthouse, and it was located in New York between Times Square and the plaza in Central Park. So
We've
it
been
was
close
like
to there,
I
haven't we?
I have been there.
yeah, it's like it was a prime residence. And one floor in his building was where he housed his records and worked with Peter Bacallion, who took over for Jules Bass. So he always kept working. He never really retired. And he was always trying to get productions made and put on the air. And even at the very end, he was going to do Santa Baby as a stage play. They had done a special on Fox. I think it was around right after my book came out around 2000 or 2001. But it wasn't as good as the old Rankin Bass because it didn't have all the talent. See, when Rankin Bass started on Rudolph, they hired all the right people. They got Maury Laws to do the music, and his music style, he told me from those GE commercials, he was mimicking the Nutcracker. And he had that in mind when he came up with his Christmas style that became known as the Rankin Bass style. It's a very happy, bouncy, lots of glockenspiels and xylophones, um, sort of an adult take, not a childish take on the music. So Maury Laws was put in place with Rudolph, and Tony Peters left the company after Rudolph. In fact, he left even before Rudolph, and Arthur hired him back because he needed him to get the thing on the air. And one of your questions was about how long did it take to produce Rudolph and these specials, and it was rather rushed. Rudolph took about 18 months, they say, but in that last year, they really had to rush things to get it ready by December 6th. And they weren't really able to go over everything and make sure everything was right. I mean, they really had to rush to get it on the air. And Bill Giles was the sound engineer, and he was a great guy and offered all kinds of great stories behind the scenes. But towards the end, Larry Romer didn't like the way that the recordings were done. For whatever reason, he thought it was all wrong, and he got real angry and basically threw a fit in Arthur and Jules' office. And they called Bill Giles in Canada and had him come out on a train to discuss everything. And Larry Romer was yelling the whole time he was there. And then Arthur and Jules took him to lunch, took Larry Romer to lunch, and then they returned without him and said, everything's fine, don't worry about it. And Bill Giles just went back to Canada. So see, Arthur really was the one in charge, and he would know if something was right or something was wrong. And initially, another one of your questions was, how did Burl Ives get involved? Well, he wasn't involved initially. When Bill Giles recorded the soundtrack, Larry D. Mann was the voice of Sam the Snowman. And Larry did Yukon Cornelius, and in their Tales of the Wizard of Oz series, he was the witch. He was in The New Adventures of Pinocchio as the Foxy Q Fibble and some of the other characters. And he played Rasputin von Rotten and Willie McBean and his Magic Machine. So he had a voice that was good for animation. And Bill Giles, thought he was great as Sam the Snowman, and was surprised when the special aired to see that Burl Ives had now been installed as Sam the Snowman. So Burl came in late and re-recorded all of Larry DeMann's parts. And they wanted a star. NBC and General Electric wanted a star to tell the story. And I believe Arthur Rankin knew that Burl Ives would be perfect because he looked like Sam the Snowman with his beard and and his size. You know, he was a
And
big
Colonel
guy.
Sanders looking mustache and stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah,
he
we
was,
love Colonel Sanders.
We do.
and Burl was had already won an Academy Award for The Big Country, and really for Cat on the Hot Tin Roof too. Came out the same year, and he was well known for his folk songs, his ballads, and he was also a writer. He was sort of a Renaissance man, and he became known years later. Everyone would recognize him as Sam, the Snowman. So I'm sure he was glad he did Rudolph and was a part of it. And then he worked with Rankin Bass on three other productions: The Daydreamer, The Bermuda Depths, and The First Easter Rabbit. So he had a nice run with Arthur Rankin and Jules Bass, but he wasn't the original intended voice of Sam the Snowman. And Romeo described Sam in his script as a nicely character out of Guys and Dolls. Um, so that's why he has the vest and the clock hanging from the vest. He kind of looks like nicely with the derby. Um, but once they got Burl Ives, that kind of set up a template for everything they did afterwards. They always got a main star, a famous celebrity to tell the story, but they didn't get them just for the name recognition, which they do today in a lot of movies. They have to have famous people in animated movies to make it to get people to come and see the movie. That isn't what Rankin Bass did. They look for celebrities that had a voice that was good for animation, like Jimmy Durante and Fred Astaire. And they all had something recognizable about their voice, and it worked well with animation. Mickey Rooney and Keenan Wynn and all of these great. Jackie Vernon from Frosty, he hadn't done any animation voices prior to Frosty. And Arthur just met him when he was signing Keenan Wynn on a movie they were making in Chicago. I forget the name of the movie. It was something like The Protectors or something. In the 69 or 68, Arthur was signing up Keenan Wynn to do Winter Warlock, and Jackie Vernon was on that same movie. And I think he discovered that Jackie Vernon had a voice that would be perfect for Frosty, and hired him for Frosty. And Jackie Vernon became known as the voice of Frosty. That was probably the biggest thing he ever did. So they got a lot of these voice actors because their voices were good for animation.
Oh, I do have I had I have this skill with what I did last year. I pulled off a little stunt where I trained Bing Crosby's voice, or I just did a voice change. Or I sung "All I Want for Christmas Is You" by Mariah Carey, and changed that recording to Bing Crosby's voice with the AI voice changer, and it sounded so much like Bing Crosby. But apparently, I don't. I got the video taken down off of YouTube because they're like, no, it's a
Oh,
copyright thing, and
well,
I know.
Bing Crosby, they Rankin Bass hired Bing Crosby to do the voice in Mouse on the Mayflower in 1968 for NBC. But something happened where he was unable to do it, or a contractual thing where he had to get out of it. And they replaced Bing Crosby with Tennessee Ernie Ford. And I think he did a really good job on the Mouse on the Mayflower. And this year with Frosty and Rudolph going on NBC, the reason it left NBC was initially Larry Romer got Rudolph on the air. So they kept working with NBC and Larry Romer's friend, and they got Cricket on the Hearth on the Danny Thomas show. They got Mouse on the Mayflower and the Little Drummer Boy. And the Little Drummer Boy was narrated by Greer Garson, and Teddy Eccles was the voice of Aaron. Teddy's a friend of mine now. And I think at that point, their deal with NBC started to sour. Perhaps Larry Romer's friend left the company. And so Arthur Rankin and Jules Bass started going around to the other two big networks. There were only three big
Yeah,
networks.
classic. There were only three networks back in the old days of television.
Right. So they got Frosty on CBS in 69, and they got Santa Claus is Coming to Town on ABC in 1970. Now, Santa Claus is Coming to Town is going to hold the record now for the longest run of a television special on the same network since Frosty is leaving CBS. But the reason that they went to CBS and ABC is I think their deal with NBC soured. So CBS said to Rankin Bass and General Electric, we want more of these. So that's how Rudolph moved in 72 to CBS and was on every year on CBS until this year. So a lot of people aren't sure why that happened, but it was the fact that Rankin Bass was sort of branching out, and they did more specials with ABC than they did with anybody because they became friends with Michael Eisner, who would later be in charge of Disney. Michael Eisner started out on ABC with the Saturday morning animation. So Rankin Bass got on The Reluctant Dragon and Mr. Toad show, and a lot of other series, the Jackson Five and the Osmonds, the Smokey the Bear show, and so forth. And then Michael Eisner started getting more nighttime work with Rankin Bass, and they did Rudolph Shiny New Year and Nestor and all these other specials, the Frosty's Winter Wonderland. And then Rankin Bass wanted to go into live action movies. So Friday night, ABC Friday Night Movie, they did The Last Dinosaur and The Bermuda Depths and Sins of Dorian Gray and a whole bunch of others. The Ivory Eight. So they had this relationship with Michael Eisner and ABC more than they had with the other two networks. But they were on all three networks at that point once they left NBC. And now they're returning to NBC. And I'm hoping that NBC does the right thing with the special. I know they're airing Rudolph in a 75-minute time slot. And I'm hoping that they're going to show, everything. Although I know they don't have the very end with the elf throwing the packages off. I have a friend who has that ending, the original 64 ending in color. And NBC should be wanting to air, the way the special was. I'm thinking what they're going to do is what they do with It's a Wonderful Life and have so-called celebrities from NBC shows talking in between when they're going to commercials about why they like Rudolph. And I don't really care for that treatment of, anything. I
I
don't
mean,
like hearing people saying why they like something. I would rather know more about the background of the special. So um, it would be smart of them to get me to talk about, you know, all the different things, all the changes that were made and so forth. But I have a feeling they're not going to do that.
yeah, I can understand. I definitely have I definitely have that kind of feeling too. I mean, they just so so the last two questions would end up being how it became a rain smash, or maybe you've already answered that, or how do you think it's managed to last so long for this long despite the rise of streaming and video platforms like YouTube and TikTok and stuff like that coming out?
All the
Well,
technology.
Technology.
one thing that's funny about the way they aired it at the beginning when it became a smash hit was it wasn't aired at 7 o'clock or later, what we consider prime time. They actually showed it in the late afternoon, like 4:30 or 5:30. And it's a little harder to gauge the success of something when it's in an early time slot like that. But they did manage to get like a 55 share of the audience, which is big when there were three networks, like we said. So they knew it was a hit because of the feedback they were getting, the letters. And Arthur Rankin and Jules Bass immediately signed a 3-picture movie deal with Joseph E. Levine in the early part of '65 because of Rudolph, because it was so new. What it did was it took the animation form that we call animagic, stop motion, and brought it to a mass audience, and then gave the art form personality. Prior to Rankin Bass, the stop motion of George Pal was very much puppet like. It wasn't like you thought of them as characters, they were more cartoons of puppets, where they didn't really have a distinct personality that you believe they really were this puppet. And Rankin Bass had that sort of style with that art form. So that was new to entertainment. And that's why it became such a big hit. And everybody wanted Rankin Bass for something. Edgar Bergen got Rankin Bass to do a pilot of Charlie McCarthy and Mortimer Snerd. And he wanted to do either a special or a series because he loved the animagic so much. So it was really a big change in entertainment that did not really exist prior to Arthur Rankin and Jules Bass getting Rudolph on the air. And then the reason it lasted so long is I really think it comes down to the writing of Romeo Muller, because he did not write down to be childlike programming. He didn't make the characters just for children. If he had, he would have wrote Santa as a ho 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 jolly type Santa Claus. But as you know from the story of Rudolph, Santa's a little more complicated than that. He's he's a little irritated by the elf song, and he's a little crabby at times, because he's not really getting in the mood of the holiday. And there's a lot of adults who are like that don't when Christmas comes around, they may not be in the mood for it, so you know, people aren't all one way. There's this dynamic to characters, and I think Romeo captured that. And part of the reason why he captured that is he based each character on friends that he knew. So Clarice was a girlfriend of his. He knew a Clarice, and he kind of wrote her with that style. Maybe she was a good singer, and she sang that great song, which Janice Orenstein actually nailed that. There's always tomorrow in one take. Bill Giles said he couldn't believe it, but she was a young girl at the time in her teens, and her mother brought her into the studio. And on the very first take, that's the one they used in the special. They did a second take, but they didn't use the second take. They used the first take of the song. But these characters were all based on people and things in Romeo's life, which I think gives the characters more of a dimension. They're not all one way, that people identify with these characters. The Bumble, as you see behind me here, he was written into the story because Romeo had a friend who had a nightmare about a big monster peeking out over mountains. And there's a scene in Rudolph where the Bumble's doing that. As Hermie and Rudolph are in the snow blizzard. He put that in there because he had this friend who had that nightmare, and he said, watch Rudolph tonight. You'll see something in it that you'll recognize. So Romeo wrote like that. He wrote with these friends and family in mind, and gave these characters a lot of different dimensions. And the Island of Misfit Toys, a lot of I found that a lot of fans kind of identify with the Misfits. And everyone identifies with Rudolph because Rudolph is an underdog, and Hermie the elf is an underdog, and they don't feel like they fit in, so they kind of get out and they go out on their own, and they want to see what they can do elsewhere. And then they do end up back at the castle, and Hermie can go ahead and be an elf, and Rudolph guides Santa's sleigh with his red nose. So it's more satisfying of a story when characters don't quite fit in, but then kind of find their place by the end of the story. And Romeo wrote like that in most of the Rankin Bass TV specials. And I think that's what gives it the longevity that we know. The 60 years for Rudolph, and the 50th for The Year Without a Santa Claus. The Year Without a Santa Claus was a storybook by Phyllis McGinley, and it only really dealt with Santa, not wanting to go out for Christmas. Romeo wrote in the Heat Miser and Snow Miser, and I would say the Heat Miser and Snow Miser are more famous than Rudolph and Frosty at this point, because a lot more people identify with them, because they're sort of they're like the boisterous characters. These Maury Laws called them braggarts. And they're just, all out there at their energy levels at the top. And when people come by my booth at these shows I appear at, Comic Cons and things like that, right away they point at the heat miser and snow miser and say, "Oh, I like that," and they'll start singing the song. Or a lot of them, even if they're foreign, they live in other countries or they came from other countries and they don't speak our language, they still know the heat miser and the snow miser. So I think Romeo and Paul Coker Jr., who designed the heat miser and snow miser, they're their biggest legacies. And Hallmark every year does an ornament now of the heat miser and snow miser, and I don't see them stopping. I think they'll keep doing the heat miser and snow miser for another 100 years if Hallmark is still in business. So
Okay.
um, Romeo Muller just had such an impact on the world of Rankin Bass that that's why they haven't faded into the past and they keep going into the future because the writing was so good. And for me, though, as an artist, what drew me into Rankin Bass wasn't so much the writing, although I knew it was well written. It was the look of it, the design of the characters. And we talked about Tony Peters. He had a simplistic, very 60s like style. And I loved that about Rudolph. But then when Paul Coker came in and did Frosty and The Year Without a Santa Claus and Santa Claus is Coming to Town, there's a nice quality about his art that I like. His lettering, his style was not, it wasn't like Disney. They weren't copying Walt Disney ever. It was the Rankin Bass look. The Paul Coker style became the Rankin Bass look. You can tell the difference between Rankin Bass and Charlie Brown's Christmas. They're
Mhm.
two totally different looks. Um,
Course.
so it was the look for me that drew me in. I love the art of Rankin Bass, Jack Davis, Paul Coker, Tony Peters. Arthur Rankin only hired the best artist he could find.
You know,
He even hired,
the art drew me in too.
yeah,
Can
he
you?
even hired Al Hirschfeld for The Daydreamer. And Al Hirschfeld is another artist I love. He did all the Broadway designs. He did a lot of movie poster art for like the Marx Brothers and Laurel and Hardy, and so Arthur knew good art, and he came from ABC in the 50s as the art director at ABC. Arthur Rankin was an artist, and he could do some pretty good art too, but he became more of a talent scout, where if he found an artist he liked, he would stick with that artist for a long time. And Paul Coker was still doing art for Arthur Rankin into the 2000s. So he really stuck with these talented artists. And in fact, I think that's why Arthur Rankin and I hit it off so well. Is my degrees in illustration, and we liked the same art, and we had that same kind of rapport about art. And the other thing that Arthur liked about me was I was a follow through guy. If I said I was going to do something, I did it. And a lot of times he would hear from people that said they wanted to write a book, but they never did it. They never followed through. I was a follow through type guy, and Arthur was a follow through person. He was the one that went to the networks, said, okay, we have this special about Frosty the Snowman. We could get it done by December, and we have Jackie Vernon and Jimmy Durante, and CBS would say, okay, let's sign the deal. And then Arthur would go hire Mushi in Japan. That's who they hired for the cell animation. and we got to get this done by, December 3rd or whatever it was. Can you do it? Well, yeah, we can do it. And Arthur would even fly to Japan and make sure they're doing it, you know? And he was sort of the taskmaster. He would, you know, call up Paul Coker and say, I need this, that, and the other thing, these designs for Hocus Pocus or whatever, and I need them by, June 3rd. And he would make sure everything kind of got done. And Jules was more laid back, Jules Bass. He primarily, his function was to write the lyrics to the music, to the songs that him and Maury Laws worked on. And then also he would work with the actors, primarily the New York actors. People like, well, Paul Frees was from California, but Paul Frees said the only people he would get on a flight to do a recording session for was Arthur Rankin and Jay Ward. So he thought a lot about Arthur Rankin and Jules Bass. But they hired, like in The Year Without a Santa Claus, George S. Irving, who was the voice of the Heat Miser. He was a New York actor. He did a lot of Broadway. So Jules would work with him. And Rhoda Mann, who was another friend of mine, she was a New York actress. So he hired her for Mother Nature. They hired Bradley Bulkey for Jangle Bells out of New York. Bob McFadden was sort of a New Yorker. He did Jingle Bells voice. So all of these New York actors, Jules Bass would work with in the studio. And Arthur was too busy with the actual production. He would fly to Japan and make sure the Japanese animators were on target to get it done by the time they needed it. So, I mean, everybody had a role in the Rankin Bass productions, but the writing was really what keeps them on the air and keeps them going strong. And it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't written for children. It was written for all ages. Even grandparents can enjoy watching Rudolph and Frosty and Santa Claus is Coming to Town, because they're so well written, and they're not written down just to children.
I have a sense of good writing, but of course I just pre-rehearse everything and try to write something, think about what I'm about to write before I end up writing it down. And every time I write a little business thing, Dad just revises it and getting to our final question. I'm an autistic person, and this show really related to me so much because I'm autistic, and I was always felt like I was just a underdog and such. And I've without him and his really persistent inability to really raise me up as as a as a good father should, I probably wouldn't
Right.
have been here the way I am today, doing this job and working from home, and with thanks to him, we have a special needs ministry in town. We have we also he and also thanks to him, whenever I see people melt down on the
Uh-huh.
internet just because they didn't get what they want, I can hear Dad saying in my head, that's the kind of behavior that makes people not want to be around you. So he doesn't want me to do that. And I can remember mom, whenever I did that, Mom and Dad would just restrain me, saying, "No, no, no, Jordan, don't do that, don't do that. That's how you misbehave. This is not what
We
you."
give you a big hug. We wouldn't really restrain you.
Oh, okay.
Right?
We got
That
big
still works now, too.
Still works, yeah.
Do you do you find that you identify a lot with the story of Frosty too?
Mm,
Be- because
well,
I get a lot of requests from parents when I sell my books that have autistic children, and they seem to gravitate more towards the Frosty book and special. And they tell me this when they order the books, that Frosty is a particular favorite for autistic people. And I find that interesting because I don't know what draws the audience into it, but it always seems like the Frosty the Snowman special is more. But I take it yours is Rudolph,
and
right?
yeah, I see it probably more Rudolph because he's different, and
Yeah.
also some other characters that have occurred over the course of the years. Even one of them, I'm just waiting for a plushie to come back from my friend James. Well, actually my cousin. It's a Stitch plushie he gave me at Disney.
There you go.
Uh,
That's good.
well, I like
So
I
Rick
like all of
Goldsmith,
this. I
I
like all of the
remember.
Rankin Bass specials. I like all of the catalog of Rankin
I
Bass, so I
I
don't
do
have.
too. And I remember when I was 8 years old, 7 years old, watching Rudolph in the den, and that was in the late 60s, early 70s.
Wow.
Yeah, in the early 70s, I remember watching Rudolph and thinking that, at the very end, when Santa's flying in his sleigh and he's saying Merry Christmas, I always felt like he was on the way to my house. You know, eventually, that was the type of Santa that I really liked.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
like, I still find that I like the Rudolph Santa the best because he's not just a one-dimensional character. He's seen with the casual outfit that he wears when he sings Jingle, Jingle, Jingle in the cave, and he has on that hunter's hat and the check pants and everything, and he's skinnier. He's the skinny Santa. So he has more of a character to him than say the Santa in Frosty or some of the other things that Santa appeared in. I like Stan Francis's voice for Santa too. He also did King Moonracer, and I just really like that voice. And that Santa to me is the real Santa.
Oh yeah. I uh I did try to I think it was back in I did contact Bradley Bolt back in 2008, and I was able to tell him when snow fell in Atlanta on December the 25th of 2010. This snow fell in Southtown.
Oh yeah,
We had 3 inches of snow that year on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. It was nice.
yeah. And Bradley Volke, he was a very close friend of mine. Um, we appeared at Chiller Theater together a couple times, and he loved it when I sent him checks because we sold Jingle Bell and Jingle Bell autograph photos on our website. So when I would send him a check, he said it was like when he used to get residual checks for he was the voice of Chumley, the seal in Tennessee Tuxedo and his tails. So he got little residual checks from that over the years. and he liked getting residual checks because it was money that you didn't expect.
Yep.
Yeah. And oh no, I got the last question right here. I don't know. I do have his autograph. I might bring it in while I like but the last question is if you could say something to Arthur Rankin Jr. about and Jules Bass about this being one of my favorite films now, it really connects with one autistic person like myself, provided they were here, what would you say?
Well, I was very close with Arthur. Jules was more of an antisocial guy. He didn't really, if you were friends with Arthur, he didn't really warm up to you. There was sort of a rivalry between Arthur and Jules, but Arthur would call me up from time to time, and we would talk, and he was more like family to me, sort of like a second father to me. So we were really close, and I really got to ask him pretty much everything I wanted to ask him. I asked him a lot of things over the years, and his memory was pretty vague because they did so many things that it was hard for him to recollect, a single production or, going back 20 years or 30 years or whatever it was. So I had to ask other people questions that may have had a better memory of how things happened. Because Arthur would forget a lot of things. In fact, that's why he flew me to New York when the Museum of Television and Radio had an evening in Arthur's honor. He wanted me there so that if he couldn't remember an answer to a question, he could just call on me, which was convenient. But yeah, if I asked him anything now, it would have been something I had already asked him when he was living. But I think he would be happy to know that you identify with Rudolph and that you still find that Rudolph is entertaining because at that museum there were quite a few people that asked him questions, and it was sort of like his Academy Award night
Wow.
because by the end of it, he had a tear in his eye because it's a special thing when when people remember you for the work that you did, and he was just touched by that. Rankin Bass is a bit different because now I am Rankin Bass, where I'm pretty much taking care of everything. I do all the interviews. I have photographs that I license. I do different things. So Arthur Rankin wanted it to live on, and Rankin Bass is living on through the work that I do. Um,
Oh, that's
so
very wonderful to hear that. There was not a lot for a little kid to watch in the 90 to mid 90s on a TV set, and on the children's videos category, Rudolph was in there, and that's why I love to watch it like every year because as a kid I would just pop in that VHS tape every single year and just run it, and the same goes for Frosty
Mhm.
and anytime it came on TV, Santa Claus is coming to town, other stuff. I love that style so much, and I and considering that I did not grow up with Power Rangers or Ninja Turtles or whatever they try out. I
right,
mean, I had PBS, I had these children's videos, I had the Disney VHS tapes, and
right.
that
You're
might as
more
well.
classic. You're more into the classics.
Yeah.